People are very proud to, to make that claim, and there's nothing wrong with that. Welcome. I'm Reverend Mark Hughes. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Racial Justice Alliance. This is White State. What I want to talk about a little bit is just something about where the state is coming from and where it's going as it pertains to the subject matter at hand. Just a little bit about our mission statement, unapologetically. This is what we're here to do. The Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, we secure sustainable power, ensuring agency and provide security for American descendants of slavery while embracing their history and preserving their culture. Some of our background, some of our experiences have been not just in the area of policy, like platforms and initiatives, but also in areas of outreach and education, community engagement, and supporting cultural empowerment. Some of the platforms and initiatives that you might be familiar with is the Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel. We created that. The Racial Equity Inclusion Belonging Office of the City of Burlington. The Racial Equity Director, you saw her this morning, her office was created by our policy. The Health Equity Advisory Panel, or commission that exists today, was also created by our policy. The Richard Kim Center, as it sits on Riverside, is one of our children as well. We've been busy in the Burlington community as well as across the state for the last 8 years. In our policy, our programs, our initiatives, our community engagement support, as well as our flagship cultural empowerment initiative, First African Landing Day, which we just had our 4th anniversary of that, which happens at Intervale, have been going on now for the last 8 years. So I'm glad to be here and spend some time with you. I just want to talk to you just a little bit about the challenge that we're facing. Because I think there's a whole lot of effort that's underway. There's a lot of things that are going on. I think I'm going to take you right up to about 1:30, by the way. And we can, for those of you who want to stick around, who can stand it, we can talk more for that other 15 minutes if you choose to. That way the conversation can be optional, because I find that a lot of people would prefer not to have the conversation. That's the problem. So here's the issue right here is systemic racism, also cultural erasure, appropriation. This right here, when you start talking about transportation, one of the things that I was just cringing on as I was listening to the conversation this morning is the fact that we really think we're doing something. I'm glad that I have a captive audience this afternoon because it goes much further than just getting some black and brown people in a room and having a conversation, the work that we're doing. In fact, we are black and brown folks. You see 4 of us. This is my staff right here, back here. There's one of us missing. It's tough enough just to get the 5 of us together. You see there's only 4 of us in the room. We probably would have preferred that all of us be here. So I just wanted to flag that for you because I think for some odd reason, and I think the reason why is it's probably Title VI money, but for some odd reason, everybody thinks if we get enough black people in the room, then we've solved the problem. And I just want to let you know that, even as organizers, we have a difficult time doing so. And if you're just doing it for the sake of just thinking that, the more black people we get in the room, the more clearly we'll understand the problem, then you've already mistaken us as being a monolith, because you will not understand the problem because you get more black people in the room. So there's the challenge, and the solution is I think some of you have already figured some of this stuff out, is centering black community to rectify historical racial inequities. So what we're talking about, what we're fixing, what we're working on are things that have been happening for generations. So the work that we're doing in housing and education, in health services, in economic development, in transportation, and even with the so-called public safety or criminal justice system, these are challenges that we're trying to dismantle that are generational challenges. So when you look at the work that you're doing in transportation, please keep in mind that they're interrelated, that they're overlapping, that they're interconnected. You can't deal with the transportation issue if you're not dealing with a housing issue. You can't deal with the transportation issue if you're not dealing with a public safety issue. And the list goes on and on and on. And I usually do like this when I say public safety. So just a little bit about the Richard Kim Center there. because what we're doing is we're delivering those programs and services that have been historically denied to Black and brown communities by serving as a cultural conduit to restore those programs and services that have been historically delivered as inefficient, ineffective, or non-existent. So what we're doing is we're working hard in the community. So if you want to connect with us in the community, with the people of the community, we'll be there. Just give myself or send, I think it's Christine at richardkempcenter.org. Send her something. I'm not going to let you get out of here without without discussing the definition of systemic racism, because I've heard so many people say it today, but I haven't heard anybody define it. There are many definitions. This is one. This is the one that we use, and it comes out of a book called Racist America. And a good old white boy from Texas named Joe Faden wrote this definition, and he was accompanied by a lady named Kimberly Ducey. I just want to stress that this is unjustly gained political economic power of whites and the continuing economic other resources, inequalities along racial lines. One of the reasons why we do not have a unified strategy at a statewide level to have these conversations is we cannot get policymakers and our administration to come to terms with a definition like this. Even the people in this room, this is hard to sit with. When you start thinking about the fact that there's also emotion-laden and racist framing that's created by whites to maintain and rationalize power and privilege. I'm talking about you. So that's why we're having such a hard time saying, yeah, this is a statewide issue. This is we need to make a mandate. I realize I'm only talking about racism, and I know right now in your minds, many of you are thinking, well, what about disabilities? What about homophobia? What about? I'm talking about racism right now. That's what I do. That's my job. If you want to hear the rest of the story, go talk to those other guys. So I just want to make that very clear. We're not so oblivious that we don't think those exist, nor are we unconcerned about them. But as much as you don't mind having a conversation about the LGBTQIA community at the Rainbow Center, or having a conversation about migrants when you go see migrant justice, you ought not mind having a conversation about racism while you're with me. Fair enough? Fair enough. So the numbers speak for themselves. I'm not going to go through the numbers. And what I'm doing right now is I'm just establishing why this is so important work. Why it is that we in a racist nation, why it is that we're struggling to try to figure out how to gain control of this system, this situation that we call transportation, and restore equity to it. And I want you to see the numbers and understand that these are challenges that we're faced with all over the place. Got to keep moving, don't have time. So here's the story. I'm going to talk a little bit about some census data. This is old census data. Somebody said today, don't worry about the census data. You better be worried about the census data. There are certain things that it will tell you in terms of demographics. We know that there's probably about somewhere around 92% of this state is white. I mean, white. There's probably another 4% that can pass for white. But there's about 92 or so percent. There's 59% of the United States that's white. Why is that important? Because if we're talking about economic development and transportation here in this state, that means if we're going to bring people in the state, because we don't want higher taxes, we want more people, right? That's what Phil said. So we're going to bring in more people, if we're creating more jobs, and inevitably you can't do that unless you bring in Black and brown people. Does that make any sense? Yeah. So what that means to me is knowing the census numbers is crucially important. I was asked a few years back to provide some input, some suggestions on strategic plan for the state. This is that. So you probably can't see it because it's a little bit of an eye chart, but down here what I said was, and this was under the category of making Vermont more affordable. How many people have heard this before? Yeah, okay, so this was feeding into that process. This was the recommendations that I was providing for that process at this level. of the state. So what I said is, how about expand transportation to facilitate diversity? I said, lower the overall cost, expand the coverage of transportation, Burlington to statewide. In other words, how do you get from Burlington to statewide and back and forth? And also expanding the coverage to Vermont from areas outside of Vermont, those with high density of Black and brown folks, like maybe Boston, like maybe New York City, like Montreal. So what we're talking about, what we've been talking about is just we need transportation just to get people who are adversely impacted, say for example, to work or to the grocery store, right? What I'm suggesting is we need to step back and look at transportation in a whole nother way. How do we get people into the state? How do we get Black and brown people into the state? Now we got to get them to stay once they come. And we know if we don't build the infrastructure and equitable infrastructure in all of those other verticals that we were talking about, they're not going to stay. I can tell you how many have left in the last 13 years since I've been here. But how do we get them here? That's transportation. That's using it, because that's the economic development that we need in order to grow as a state, unless you don't want to grow. How do we get people who are in Chittenden County to the furthest most parts of the state and bring them back? That's transportation. That's what we're not talking about. The other thing we're not talking about, is extending services. What about the time frames in which these are operating? What about the costs? So some of that stuff is important. And the big one, I'm not going to give you a whole lot of information on, but I'll just ask you to contemplate it, is I'm going to give you some numbers. $838 million. What's that number? It's almost $1 billion. Was the transportation budget this last year for the state of Vermont? $838 million. Unprecedented. 713 million. Anybody know what that was? Last year, same budget. $580 million. How much? What is that? Year before? Where is this money going? Who's getting it? Whose hands is this money finally making it to ultimately? Better yet, whose hands is it not making it to? Now I won't bore you with ARPA details or CARES details about where that money ended up, because I can tell you where it didn't end up. If you want to talk about equity, let's talk about economic equity. Who's getting the contracts? Who Black and brown even has a construction company? And what are we doing to create them? You want to talk to me about transportation equity? Talk to me about this. Because at the end of the day, systemic racism is a divide, a political and an economic divide along racial lines. And if you're not fixing it with money, you ain't fixing it, honey. So, there is no executive or legislative priority for this work. There is not. The health equity bill did not start with the governor. It started with us. The economic equity bill that failed last year did not start with the governor. It did not start with the legislature. It started with us. The racial equity executive director position for the state of Vermont did not start with the governor. In fact, it was vetoed the first time by the governor. It started with us. It did not start with the legislature. The land ownership access bill did not start with the legislature. It started with the folks at ceding power down south and endorsed by us. None of this work is starting, even with when you start thinking about the work that the planning, how many people were with planning commissions? Don't be shy. Who's with the planning commission? Aha! No, I'm just kidding. So even if with this work that started with y'all in V-Trans, as a result of a policy that came out last year, That's not revolutionary. That's just a drop in the bucket. It's not even getting after what it is we're talking about, and it's certainly not talking about economic equity. It's almost like back to the old proverbial, if you go with a public safety conversation and you tell the police, please take your knee off my neck. It's not enough. I'm not going to mention the Champlain Parkway today. But it's not enough for us to say stop sending highways through our neighborhoods. It's not enough. It's not enough to say, oh, I got to satisfy Title VI. So I guess I'll see if I can round up a bunch of black people so I can check that box so we can get this money. It's not enough. And think about this, the folks at the school with Title I, the folks at Chittenden County Regional Planning over here, HUD, everybody's looking to get black people together so they can get their federal funding. We're getting tired of it. There is no legislative or executive priority. Nobody's talking about routes, opening routes up to densely populated areas. I'm not hearing that conversation. Maybe you are. Direct routes out of Chittenden into the rest of Vermont. Nobody's talking about the operating hours. Nobody's talking about construction trades funding. In other words, get those black and brown people, bring them together and send them to school so they can learn these trades so they can get some of that $838 million next year. Or teach them how to start their own construction companies. We're not having those conversations. So thank you. Really glad I had an opportunity to hang out with you. I'm happy to hear your questions. But before you do, I just wanted to let you know that when we put forward the executive director, that position to Sonny Davis's job in 2018, when we created that legislation, it's called Act 9. When we created that, we created it programmatically. Now listen, this is it's going to seem a little bit off point, but I'm done ranting. You can just calm down now. Okay, but what I mean by programmatically is that policy is not enough. Policy by itself is dead. Training and policy is better. Training, policy, and data collection is great. Training, policy, and data collection and impact assessment of emerging and existing policies and programs is really awesome. But training, policy, data collection, the aforementioned, as well as integration into your HR systems to cause individuals and departments to be accountable in this work is where we're trying to go programmatically. Statewide, all systems.
How about a little oversight too?
Yeah, HR, yeah. So that's my wife, I can't say anything else. So the thing all I'm really getting at is that there is a programmatic approach to the work that we're doing. And if we're just sticking our finger in the water and we're stepping away, we're not getting at it. I just wanted to highlight some of the programmatic areas that we intended for the Racial Equity Executive Director's Office. This is the last thing I'll tell you, and then I'll listen to your questions, is that one of the things that we did to try to push the envelope, just take just a couple seconds just to read this, just 30 seconds, 15 seconds. How many people remember the public health emergency? Racism is a public health emergency. We did that. We did that at the City Council in Burlington, the Racial Justice Alliance. We also did it with the mayor with 30 organizations in the regional area, but this is probably what you didn't know. This is a joint resolution at the legislature. The Vermont legislature, this is an approved joint resolution from the Vermont legislature that says that racism is a public health emergency, and they resolved that they would commit to the sustained and deep work of eradicating systemic. This is your legislature. This is what they said they would do. So somebody told me a long time ago, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. They've made the commitment. But we still don't have their leadership in this area, because all we're doing is we're running around going from health equity to economic equity. I'll come back next year to land and home equity, to racial equity, there is no unified strategy like Joe Biden did. Where he said, this is what's going to happen. Come back and we'll talk about it. I'm done. I thank you for your time. I would love to hear your questions or criticisms, or else if you just brought any fruit to throw.
I do have a question. It is all intertwined, and as you say, does this also intertwine with language justice? About the barriers, about how we say things, around, in a way where it makes sense for the others that,
What's your first language?
What?
What's your first language? Your primary language?
English.
Okay. Anybody in here have a primary language other than English? No? Isaac, what's your primary language?
Tree, West African.
Tree?
I'm from Ghana.
You're from Ghana. Do you think this should be about language too?
I think it goes back to exactly what you were saying. We asked about the what ifs regarding every other scenario. We talk about the, LGBT, community. Then we talk about, the indigenous folks. Like, we need a space that is primarily to discuss what our initiative, what our agenda is,
Which is
racism.
All right, thank you.
Systemic racism. So, there's spaces for, obviously there's spaces for language justice, as you mentioned. This space right now, our primary lens is focusing on systemic racism, trying to, eradicate that.
All right, I appreciate that. So I think the best answer we can get on that is the one who would be primarily impacted. And we heard from the only other person who has a primary language of other in the room. Sorry about that. I shouldn't have said other. You said it was tree?
Tree.
Okay. Adrienne?
Hi, Matthew, can I just clarify
Yes.
what you meant by language?
By the language is how it's being interpreted out there, from others, point of view.
So like how it's all jargony.
Yeah, it's jargoning to the point where, like he said, he has a different language,
Yeah.
but, it all ties into, that racial, disparity. It's in the biases of the system too as well. I think just, one side or another, it affects everyone. And, the way I look at it is, what the Reverend over here said, the good brother said, is that it's a broader scope that, of, the racial inequity. It's a system that, has been, preceded, only one, just one, culture. And now we're getting, now we're getting growth, of other diversity, within our culture. And we're trying to broaden that where it, works for everyone in their same language as it feels comfortable for them.
So like where everyone across the state knows what the terms are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks.
Other questions? Sarah?
Sarah. Radra.
Postdoc.
Yeah.
Sarah Postdoc. No. Go ahead, Sarah.
I just had a question. I think her name was Susanna, who was during the discussion. She kind of stopped herself at the end of one question about like, should these people even be kind of making these decisions and stuff? And I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate.
I may have not been in the room, quite honestly.
Okay.
Can you tell us more, or can anybody else in the room mention more about that point of the conversation?
She was kind of going on, I mean, I'm not totally sure, that's why I was curious about it, but I think she was kind of going the track about like, because they were talking about kind of opening like decision-making to like different groups and everything, but she was trying to make the point like, well, should we even be the ones making these decisions? Because the whole system is really messed up, and I just wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to elaborate on that at all. Jamie's leaving because she really doesn't want to have this conversation, no, it's fine. Right now, you're technically, you are on break right now. So if anybody who wants to, get out of here, don't feel like you can't just get up and leave. You're on break. Other questions, Isaac?
Where can we find all the information, the data cards and et cetera, that you shared?
So it should be, everything's up here except for the website. So this is the website right here. If you just drop the info, that's the domain, that's the website right there.
We're recording the talks too.
So if you go to www.vtracialjusticealliance.org, you can just go to the data cards and you can find the data cards there. I think the big takeaway, at least in my mind, is for those of y'all who are the policy folks and how you're aligning yourselves to do the work in terms of this upcoming legislative session and also in your local jurisdictions. I think the focus, the hyper focus that we have on transportation, because we are transportation, because your name is transportation, you're in the RPC, I came here to do my job. I think that's really, it could be hurting us in some way. So I think the big takeaway is get outside of that. And then the other one would be clearly as far as, what impact transportation can have, or what other influences that are being placed on this transportation, this conversation about transportation. When you think about how we use it as a tool to create, again, this goes right back to the whole reason why I brought this whole thing up is this is about diversity, and this is about equity. When we're talking about diversity, what we're talking about is we know that in order to grow the population in any particular demographic, in this case, it being Vermont, there needs to be transportation strategies that will facilitate that. And then in terms of economic equity, we need to be able to look beyond, this whole idea of, you guys, we got you to the table. So, you're at the table. So now, we can hear what you have to say and we can get your opinion. And it's like a group of black teenagers in Winooski. Come on. Really? Right. And that's on the website. I didn't make that up. So what I'm saying is that, to have that conversation, to have a conversation about how transportation creates equity, economic equity, because that should be the first and the last equity that we're talking about when we're talking about eradicating systemic racism. If we're going to have that conversation, then we have to be able to wield transportation in a way to where the $890-some million that come into this state is actually being routed into the hands of the right people, where we are a state where we know we have no resources whatsoever that are black and brown owned related to the business of construction, nor have we had any intention on creating that kind of capacity, despite the fact that we have hundreds of millions of dollars that come through this state on a regular basis. That's the kind of equity that we should be using transportation for.
Can I just throw out?
Yeah, I'm done.
This is really kind of a rhetorical question. I think it might speak a little bit to the question that was raised about whatever Susanna was saying and how do we know what she meant because we're not her. But ask yourself the question, why is Vermont so white? It's not because it's cold, because you got a bunch of people that went to Canada, and you have states surrounding us that have bigger black and brown populations. Vermont is so white because the people that are making decisions wanted it to be white.
I appreciate that. Again, it's my wife, so, but she's been in the state for 50 years, so there you go. Were you gonna say something, Dale?
Mark, I got a question, and I know you're